The law is of faith for the influencers must admit basically, quote, Jewish identity, that is physical circumcision, vindicates covenant membership, that is justification, which then warrants continued obedience to Torah in order to maintain covenant membership earned either at birth or by conversion. So that's what I interpret as the law is of faith for the influencers. But then Paul says, rather, the law is not of faith. Rather, the one who does these things shall live by them. So Paul challenges this idea that the law is of faith with his slogan, the law is not of faith. What can that mean? Here's what we learned last week. For Paul, however, even though his opponent's theology included most of the right verses with most of the right players, sadly, they had reached most of the wrong conclusions. In its broadest application, as understood by Paul, the law is not of faith, right? This is our lift from Galatians 3:12. The law is not of faith. This is the first clause. This term that Paul uses, the law is not of faith, conveys the idea that, quote, the law is not a salvific document, end quote. Plain and simple. God didn't give the law for that purpose. Quote, the doing of the law was not designed to subsequently produce salvific faith in God, end quote. That, at its broadest sense, is what Paul must mean when he says the law is not of faith. However, and that would have been nuance 2 that we talked about above. However, there is a smaller, what I call immediate sociological context for the way he is probably spinning this phrase, the law is not of faith. And I say in my commentary that the immediate context of his argument was against the sectarianism of his day. The Jewish-only nationalism that was pervasive in his day, this idea that all Jews and only Jews shared a place in the world to come, that quote from the Talmud, Sanhedrin 10:1, I believe it is. He was using this phrase, the law is not of faith, to challenge this idea that the Torah was for Jews only and that covenant membership was a Jewish-only concept. And this means, so as I read my commentary, it says, within the immediate context of his argument against sectarianism, this phrase, the law is not of faith, likely means, quote, physical circumcision, that is works of the law, do not or does not count towards forensic justification, which is read here as genuine covenant membership by the influencers, end quote. You guys understand my meaty paraphrase of this idea, the law is not of faith? Just merely being a Jew, whether by birth or by conversion, does not count towards God declaring you as justified or forensically justified, which today we would call salvation, but in their day they used the term genuine covenant membership. All right. So alternately, with all that information in front of us, we could understand this phrase basically to be Paul's challenge that after reading Habakkuk 2:4 in Galatians 3:11, and then reading Leviticus 18:5 in Galatians 3:12, the very next verse, after quoting both of those verses, Paul expects his readers and opponents alike to come to the same conclusion that he came to. And what was that? We're near the top of page 125 in my notes. This is very important as we go into tonight's study. Both circumcised Jews and uncircumcised Gentiles, as faith-centered covenant members, followed in faithfulness to Torah. That was one of the main tenets of what he was teaching as well. However, this is really an alternate reading in my opinion. It's alternate because it may in fact be only a subtext at this point. I don't think Paul is trying to emphasize the idea that Jews and Gentiles must follow in faithfulness to Torah, because one of the primary problems facing the Gentile believers in that day was that they were confusing the real purpose of Torah obedience. And so Paul's going to have to kind of give some caution to them as to how they should really be keeping Torah. It's because of the misuse and misunderstanding of Torah obedience by the influencers that Paul's probably not just going to come out straightforward and tell them, just keep Torah, kind of the way that we do it today. In fact, I think he's going to really put some of the obedience to Torah on back burner status. We know he does that with circumcision later on when we get to Galatians chapter 5. We're going to see that. However, so I say in my commentary, this alternate reading where we just see Paul telling the Jews and Gentiles that since they're already believers, just go ahead and continue keeping Torah. That's, I think, a subtext at this point. I don't think that's his main point. So I say, however, we've already addressed the primary indictment of Paul's argument, of course, against the influencers in our exegesis above. And what was that? The version of physical circumcision that the influencers were teaching, in Paul's opinion, was a, quote, law of the flesh, end quote. And as such, God did not recognize it as faith-centric. See my point? Their version of circumcision, which was centered primarily on turning a person into a Jew if he wasn't already born with that status, their version of circumcision was perverse, in Paul's opinion. And in Paul's mind, their distortion of law, and I put the word law there in quotes, their distortion of law was, quote, not of faith. And that's why he says it that way. The law is not of faith. Your version of law, your distortion of law is not accurate.